Hi, my name is Paul Arnold and I'm a qualified psychotherapist and I'm also a trained coach. And I want to talk about how to deal with shame. And this is such an enormous area. I can only just touch the very surface of it. And there have been some really great people who've talked about this, obviously most notably TED Talks, Brené Brown, Patricia de Jong, to name just but two. Look, I'm going to try to share a bit of theories about this. I'm going to try to give you a few strategies. But I would actually say that this is one of those areas that psychotherapy can really make a profound difference. And I'll explain more about why that is. But if you think about it, shame is a very deep sense of emotional hurt. And, psychotherapy really comes into its own when we're dealing less on the cognitive, less on the behavioral front, and more when we're dealing with the messiness of emotions. So let's start to tackle into this stuff. It's very interesting because very often in psychotherapy, we don't even talk about shame. We allow the world to spring up itself. We may talk about embarrassment, but shame is such a powerfully loaded word. Even in psychotherapy, it can often be within the shadows. And shame itself just lives in the shadows all the time. But the reality is we all have shame. I'm not particularly biblical, but you just think of the very first story in Genesis is one about building about shame. So consequently, it's something that makes us hide and makes us run away from. And shame absolutely knocks our confidence, and it turns against ourselves, and we sort of make ourselves feel small and unworthy in the space of shame. And I've heard phrases used like a sickness of the soul or the swampland of the soul. So it just shows you how pejorative the language is around shame. And it absolutely closes us down and makes us feel small and unworthy, And critically, it puts us out of a relationship from ourselves and with others. It is a very fragmenting thing that makes us split off from ourselves. And very often, it makes us take behaviors like we'll eject ourselves before being rejected. So we will split ourselves off from others for fear of being found out. Let's talk a bit about some of the theories behind it. The first thing is just on a much bigger, cultures have used shame incredibly powerfully to influence. People are shamed in society. If you do things that society doesn't condone, then basically it will shame you. And at that point, forces compliance. So in that sense, shame has been used to create a conditional behavioural bias into us. If then, only if you do that, can we then accept you. And it's obviously used inside families as well. And the important thing is that we have this model, which is we have a behavioural level about how we are, but then we have this identity level at a much higher level. And the trouble is that shame gets converted from being a behavior. We did something wrong. And it gets taken up to be an identity, a sense of what I call felt badness. We are fundamentally flawed within ourselves. And very often we are therefore unlovable. And we have that massive fear of rejection, of abhorrence, if people were ever to find that out about us. So consequently, we keep it deeply hidden for fear of that massive rejection, not only of ourselves physically, but actually of who we are. Because if we get rejected for who we are, therefore we crumble at that as well. So, Bromberg, amongst others, talks about this idea about our splitting, how we dissociate parts from ourselves. The parts that we can't bear to admit to. And these get sort of split off and dissociated from ourselves. And very often they get projected onto other people. The parts we hate the most about it will project onto other people. And there's a great phrase that sort of shamed people shame people. And very often we'll develop strategies to protect us. So grandiosity is very often a way to hide the deep flawedness we have within ourselves. We try to protect ourselves, And obviously we then find that, we use other defensive strategies as well. So I think it's very interesting that sort of shame actually hides behind other emotions. So aggression, is one of the ones, and actually fear are ones that actually shame hides behind, Now, one particular model which I quite like is called the compass of shame, like, the 4 axes, and where it said like, to really build on this, we'll attack others. Because if we attack others, it takes a focus off of us. But actually underneath, we're more likely to really attack ourselves and see ourselves to be deeply flawed human beings. And we'll then withdraw this idea, we'll run away from things because we don't want to be in a situation where we could be found out. And often we'll try to avoid as well. We'll use distraction techniques to try to free ourselves from that space. So very often shame will therefore reappear through, excessive eating, drinking, smoking, doing all those other things that people do. So fundamentally, if we look at the strategies, what we're seeing is we're seeing a fragmentation of self. And we often in psychotherapy talk about either people need a glue to stick themselves back together, or they need a solvent to somehow break the parts down. And this is definitely a space that psychotherapy works with glue. One of the most powerful papers I read on this was by a lady called Jessica Van Vliet, who talks about 5 different stages. And I'm going to rearrange the stages that work better for me than the way that she lays them out. But I think the first stage is, there's an understanding we need to get to allow us to have acceptance. So like, why did that happen? What happened in your childhood in the way that people treated you that led you to hold on to that shame and that sense of unworthiness within you? And then out of that, we can then move to a place of acceptance. I always say through understanding comes acceptance. So if we can accept that this wasn't necessary to do with us, it was to do to the environment, and that sure we did a bad thing, but that doesn't mean we're a bad person, then actually we can be more likely to accept it. And I think the very first stage is like, how can you accept it to yourself? Write it down, look it on the page, think about it. And then ideally to be able to express it and tell someone about that stuff. Someone you trust implicitly, someone you know who's going to stand by you. And not push you into further rackings of shame and guilt, and be sort of, going like that with you. Frankly, that's one of our roles as psychotherapists. We can be that person who will witness your shame. Then as such, we can then come to a point of refocus. This is an idea about, let's put this into context. Sure, you did a bad thing. Sure, you're not perfect. Join the rest of the world. Now let's look at what are the good things about you. Let's build you up. Let's actually start to bring you back together and realize you do have a bit of that, but that's not the end of the world. You are good in many other ways. And the more we can accept that and accept the shadow, as Jung always talks about, then that's a very powerful place to be. And then we can then go to a place of connection. Fundamentally, what shame does is it takes us away from ourselves and away from others. And the most important thing with shame is to go out there and connect. The power of being accepted is the most important space, because there is then final evidence that you can be accepted and it can be okay. And then comes is the resistance, reject and assert your worth. So it's not one of like, oh yes, I am bad, 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 please, please beat me up even more. It's, yeah, I got that. I accept that. I accept I didn't do that particularly well. But you know what? We're all flawed. And there's some very great features about me as well. So I think there's something about how can we hold on to our sense of self and not crumble and give in to shame, which could absolutely destroy us. You know, and I sort of loved what, you know, that very tragic story from France that was, so Giselle Pellicot said, is that shame must change sides. You know, very often it's not you who was the perpetrator, but someone did an act against you. Which really leads me to one of the roles that psychotherapy plays. It's very interesting. A lot of the work would suggest that the issue with shame is not the act, but how other people around you responded to the way when you did that act. If they're appalled and they pull away and they, oh my God, how could you do that? That is the act. It's the witnessing of the act that basically is the shamefulness, not the act itself. It's how people react to it. And the fundamental role that we give in the psychotherapeutic room is we witness it with unconditional positive regard. We accept the flawedness, we accept the vulnerability, we accept that people have done maybe some quite shocking things. But to accept that act does not define them. And it's the holding of them in that space, witnessing their shame, is a lot of the work that we do there. You know, and I think actually out of that, we can then come to a place where we can sort of celebrate the vulnerability and the bravery, the openness to deal with that stuff. So shame is a very powerful behavioral influence. It's very powerful upon shaping who we see ourselves to be. And the more we can rid the shame and come to peace with the shame, then actually the more we are going to be more in control of our lives. Anyway, I hope that helped. Take care.